There are many ways to handle events in JavaScript. An event is something that happens, like in HTML, where we have onClick or onDoubleClick attributes. We have similar events in JavaScript. However, with jQuery, we can eliminate the use of using those event attributes and allow our JavaScript to automatically listen to our actions. Not like a spy, but for when an event is triggered. We're going to cover a lot of different events since many of them can and probably will be used very often. So our first one is focus. Remember in HTML, we learned what focus and blur are. If you don't remember, here's a quick reminder. Focus is when you click on and you activate an element, such as the text area. And blur is when you unfocus, or you unclick, or you move away from the focused element. To create a focus event in jQuery, we write our code like so. So our jQuery here is going to select our text area. Our event is focus, and it has one parameter here. Now this parameter is actually a function, and inside this function, you can see the curly bracket there, we can write whatever we like. Our HTML here is text area, has a placeholder, it just says click in me. We end the text area. Line break, input type is equal to text, placeholder is click in me. So you see here where it says click in me and click in me for both the input and the text area. What our code says we're going to do here is when we focus in on our text area, it's going to change the CSS, it's going to change its display property to none, so it's going to make it invisible. So when we click it, it just disappeared. Now there's nothing we can do to get it back now unless we use more jQuery or JavaScript. But I also have the input in here to show you that I can click in here and this one's not going to disappear. And that's because we specifically specified that this should only happen to text areas. Now if we have more than one text area, this is going to affect all of them. If you only want it to affect the one text area, I would suggest adding an ID in there. So the function inside the focus event, which is this part here, is going to run every single time that we focus on our text area. Now that is one way of using the focus event. We can also use it without the function inside of it. If we use it with no function inside, we're telling the user's browser to automatically focus on something. For example here, we selected the element that has an ID of focus, which is our button here. ID of focus, that's the button element. When we click it, it's going to select our input, ID input, and just going to focus on it. So let's try this out. Click the button. It automatically focuses me in the text area. Click out of it, click it again, and it puts me back in the text area. The focus event with no function did exactly that. It focused on what we told it to. In this example, we used the click event as well, and we'll cover that one really shortly. Next we have blur. To blur means to unfocus, and is also used on elements that can be activated or selected. On the left we have jQuery, on the right we have our HTML. jQuery selects ID, input, then blur, which is our input section here, because that matches our ID with our input element. When we focus on it, we're going to tell this to blur, and we'll cover this in just a moment. So I click it. No matter how many times I click it, it's going to unselect it for me. It's going to blur me out. This here is our this selector, and this is a mighty strong subject in jQuery. So I think we should learn about that now. When we're writing code inside an event in jQuery, we use this to reference the selector. So what I mean is we have our selector here, and I'm just going to select element, and that can be anything in there. Instead of element, we could just write div. And while we're talking about the currently selected inside of an event, we can just write this. So we don't have to write our long element name, or if we were getting really precise and we wanted to go div special ID with a long name, something like that, we could just write this, and that will refer back to our original selector. Remember we said the $sign function is similar to function $ID, and it just returns document get element by ID, and then the parameter, which is matched up here. And how we can use that to manipulate parts of the DOM, the document object model, like the elements in inner HTML. We could have wrote the same function is right here, and we could have selected div IDs dot inner HTML is equal to new HTML inside this div element, and that would display new HTML inside this div element. Word for word, exact same characters. Well, the this selector is the same thing, but it only works inside an event and will refer to that exact element. It will make more sense once we use it a little bit more. The hover event accepts two functions. The first is the onMouseOver, if you will, function, and the second is the onMouseOut, if you will, again, and that's the onMouseOut function. The syntax looks like this. We have our selector here, we just select anything, dot hover, opening parentheses, we have our first function, and this is our first parameter, then we have a comma here, our second parameter, and then we just close it off. Actually, this doesn't need to be there. That would throw you an error. So you see between the two functions is a comma to separate them, just like how we separate parameters. You can think of hover as a function with two parameters. However, these parameters must be in the form of a function. So again, we have our first parameter here, we have our comma, we have our second parameter here. Inside here is when you put your mouse over the currently selected. And the second function is what's going to happen, or the effect to take place when the mouse is not over the selected element any longer. Now let's go ahead and make this work. So in our example, we have div demo1, or that's the ID of demo1, dot hover, and this is what's going to happen with our first function. So remember, the first function is when you mouse over it. We said this.css, border 1 pixel solid red. Remember how this is going to refer to this up here, because this is an event, so this means currently selected. Or if you watch what I highlight real quick, this means this. And then our second parameter here is what's going to happen when we mouse out, or I guess when we unhover. We have this .css border, and we just wrote 0. So our demo is right below this. Let's see what happens. Mouse over it. We have a border, 1 pixel solid red. It's very obvious. We know that's working. We move out. We have no border. That's exactly what we want. Border, 1 pixel solid red. Border, 0 for the mouse out. And we will cover .css eventually. For those who can't wait, .css has two parameters. The first one is your CSS property. So for example, you have border, and then your second one here is your CSS value. And here is the value, 1 pixel solid red. That's all I'm going to say about this right now. We'll talk about this a little bit later. Then we have keys. There are 3 events grouped together in this section. So we have key down, key press, and key up. They all act the same, but the difference is when the code is executed. So key down is when the button is being pressed down. So when your button is going from currently standing up, I guess, to when you put your finger on it and you press down. The HTML attribute for that is onKeyDown. And key up is when the button is being released. So you press down, when you release your key, that's when this is going to take effect. The HTML attribute for this is onKeyUp. And lastly, we have key press. And this is the action of key down and key up together. So when you press down and you lift up your finger from that particular key, that is key press. And the HTML attribute for that is onKeyPress. So for the sake of simplicity, we will use key press in this example. However, if you wanted to, you could switch out key press for key down or key up, and this will work the exact same way for all 3. So first we have ID of demo text area, and that's what's currently being selected. We can tell by the $. Key press, that's our event, and this is our function. Inside of our function, which is inside the curly brackets here, is what we want to execute. And all we want to execute every time we press a key is to alert us that there was a key pressed. So when I click in here, clicking in and out isn't going to do anything. As soon as I press a key, it's going to alert me. Just like that. Now in the event that you use key press, key down, or key up, you might not want to alert the user every single time that they actually press a key, because that can get and will get very, very annoying for them. Next we have mouse. There are actually 7 mouse events. Every single one of them can be used the same way as the example that will be given below. But first, we need to know what the 7 events are. So first we have mouse down. That's when you click your mouse down, but you do not release it yet. So that's, if you listen real closely, I click my mouse down, I haven't released it yet. That's when I release it. This has a similar HTML attribute, and that's on mouse down. Next we have mouse up, and that's when you release the mouse from clicking. So remember, I click down, Now when I click up, this is what mouse up is. And its HTML attribute is onMouseUp. Then we have mouse over. And this is when you move your mouse over an element. And its HTML attribute is onMouseOver. Then we have mouse enter. And this is when your mouse enters an element. This is similar to mouse over, but it's not quite the same. And there is no similar HTML attribute for this. We have mouse leave, and this is when your mouse leaves the entered area. So mouse enter and mouse leave usually work together, hand in hand, and there is also no HTML attribute for that. Then we have mouse move, and this is when your mouse is in the targeted element and it moves. So if this was our element here, let's say this is a weird shaped div that we're looking at, and I move my mouse into the highlighted area and I move it around. That's what mouse move is. The HTML attribute for that is onMouseMove. And lastly, we have onMouseOut. And that's when your mouse moves out of an element. And this is often used with onMouseOver. So when you move your mouse over something, you're putting your mouse over it, or onMouseOver. When you remove your mouse from that element, it is now moving your mouse out. And the HTML attribute for that is onMouseOut. As an example, we can write ID mouse event, and that's what is selected, mouse down, function, and this is our function here, and we just wrote this append mouse down. When we append something, we're just going to add more to it. So right away we know that this is going to append mouse down. It means it's going to add more text in there that says mouse down. Now same selector, mouse event, this time it's mouse up, and when we move our mouse up or when we unclick, then it's going to select this. Again, that's the same thing as the selected here. It's going to append bold, mouse up, bold, space. Now let's take a look at this demo. Mouse down, it said mouse down. Mouse up, it says mouse up. And I can just keep doing this. And it's just going to keep on doing this. Just want to throw a note in there real quick. Technically, click, double click, focus in, focus out, and hover, as well as toggle are all actual mouse events, along with the ones that are mentioned above. So the 7 plus all of these. Then we have toggle. And toggle is a very, very useful event. This will allow us to hide and show elements instantly. And it will let jQuery figure out what the CSS status is. So what this means is if an element has its display, its CSS display as none, then jQuery will make it show up. And if the element has display inline or block, or it is just showing up and its display basically is not none, then it will hide this element. And like always, we have a demo here. So what this is it selects button toggle. Let's look for button toggle here. ID, it's in the button. When we click it, it's going to call a function. And again, that's this here. This is the currently selected from the event dot next. That method means it's going to select the next item in the DOM, the document object model. So what that means is currently this element is selected, but it's going to select the next one now, which is span. And then we have dot toggle, and that will toggle it on and off, or hide it and then show it, and hide it and show it. This is exactly what it will look like. I click it once, it hides. I click it again, it shows up. So basically, what is hidden will display, and what's displayed will be hidden. And lastly, just some finishing notes here. We haven't touched on a few events because there are still a few more, but we will in the next class. Also, one of the reasons I really enjoy jQuery is because it allows us to add events to our page without having to display it in our HTML source. So when somebody looks at your source on your page, they won't see onMouseDown or onClick attributes in any of your tags. For novice web developers, this will throw them for a little bit of a loop for you. You now understand how this works, and this is no big deal for you.